Under the bright lights and the buzz of high society conversations, the hall was buzzing with fashion and exclusivity. Stephen Curry, accustomed to attention, moved with the same agility he displayed on the court. He waved to acquaintances, participated in quick chats, but felt the weight of a disconnection. Everything seemed meticulously calculated, until something genuine caught his eye. At the back of the hall, a distinct figure contrasted with the environment. It was an elderly black woman, her skin revealing the weight of decades, but her eyes shining with a strength that few could ignore. She dressed simply, but her posture exuded dignity. Stephen felt drawn to her presence and decided to approach. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Stephen Curry." "Good evening, my son. I can call Eleanor." They began to converse, and Stephen soon discovered that Eleanor had been invited by the hosts as a way to diversify the guest list. This troubled him. It felt less like a sincere gesture and more like an attempt to ease consciences. Eleanor, however, seemed immune to the condescension around her. As the night progressed, the two talked about Eleanor's youth in the segregated South, the challenges she faced, and the barriers she overcame with resilience and courage. Stephen felt a growing admiration, but he also noticed the envious glances from other guests, the whispers, the muffled laughter. It was as if Eleanor were an out-of-place element at this carefully curated party. The tipping point came when one of the most influential men in the hall, visibly intoxicated, approached. With a sarcastic smile, he posed a question. "Ma'am, did you happen to lose your way to the kitchen? Or did you come to make sure we all have our drinks served?" Silence fell over the hall like a cold wave. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who remained composed. Stephen clenched his fists, but before he could react, the elderly woman's firm voice cut through the air. "My place is not defined by you or anyone here. I am where I need to be, and that is here." Eleanor's response echoed like thunder in the hall. The man recoiled, surprised by a reply he clearly did not expect. But he still tried to downplay it. "It was just a joke, ma'am. No need to take it so seriously." The tension was thick, almost palpable. The disrespectful comment seemed to resonate throughout the hall, freezing everyone in place. Stephen, blood boiling, could no longer remain silent. He stepped forward, confronting the man who had mocked Eleanor. "Do you want to explain your joke?" Stephen said in a low voice, but heavy with indignation. The man, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to cover it up with a nervous smile. "It was just a joke, folks. No need to make a scene." Stephen let out a dry laugh, but his eyes were as hard as steel. "A joke? Well then, explain what's so funny about disrespecting someone like her. I'm curious." The hall, once vibrant, felt like a silent battlefield. Guests began to distance themselves, as if the scene were an intense flame too hot to endure. Discomfort spread, but Stephen stood his ground. He knew this was bigger than just one night, or one insult. "Do you find it funny to treat someone with disdain?" Stephen continued, his voice gaining strength. "Maybe it's time to reevaluate your ideas about humor." Eleanor, until then quiet, looked at Stephen with a blend of admiration and caution, but her own experience told her that this moment could not go unanswered. She took a step forward, directly confronting the man, who now seemed to shrink before the strength of this duo. "Forget," she said, addressing the guests who were trying to mediate the situation. "You always ask us to forget, to move on. But forgetting is a privilege I've never had. You feel comfortable applauding symbolic gestures, calling it inclusion, but racism hidden behind good intentions is still racism." Eleanor's words echoed like muffled thunder. The entire hall seemed to hold them in the air, unable to ignore the truth they carried. The event director, visibly flustered, tried to placate. "Everyone is here to have a good time. We don't need to turn this into something bigger." "Bigger?" Eleanor repeated, looking directly at him. "This is already bigger. It always has been. You just choose not to see." Stephen, standing beside her, felt a wave of admiration and shame at the same time. Admiration for the strength of this woman, who faced years of oppression with her head held high. Shame because he knew that, despite his own struggles as a black man, he had never experienced the depths of the historical burden she carried with such dignity. As Eleanor spoke, some guests began to approach. Not to confront her, but to listen, perhaps for the first time, to the weight of words that had never been considered. Others, however, discreetly slipped away, as if they could escape the responsibility of reflection. The moment that had already seized the hall transformed into something even greater when Stephen raised his voice again. "I see this as a moment we cannot let pass. Ms. Eleanor is not just facing a bad night. She is carrying centuries of exclusion and prejudice. And what you are witnessing now is not just about her, it's about all of us." Eleanor, standing beside him, placed her hand on his arm, signaling that he had spoken enough. "The struggle doesn't need long speeches, my dear," she said with a calm smile. "It needs consistent actions." The phrase silenced Stephen immediately. He knew she was right. Words were important, but it was action that truly made a difference. He watched as Eleanor regained her serene posture, as if she were the owner of the room and not a guest who had been treated like an intruder. Gradually, a few people approached Eleanor. Some offered timid apologies, while others, still uncomfortable, sought ways to escape the situation without confronting their own shortcomings. The atmosphere of glamour and relaxation that had filled the party at the beginning of the night transformed into something heavier, more reflective. However, there was something even more striking. Eleanor did not shrink under the gazes or the weight of the moment. On the contrary, she seemed to grow, her spirit illuminating a space that had previously felt devoid of meaning. When the night came to an end, Stephen and Eleanor were outside, breathing in the fresh and quiet air of the street. Stephen looked at her, still absorbing everything he had witnessed. "You shouldn't fight so much," he said, his voice carrying sincerity. Eleanor met his gaze for a moment before inviting him in. "The fight has never been a choice, my young man. It's a necessity. But sometimes, it's thanks to people like you that it's worth it." Stephen didn't respond. He knew those words carried something he still needed to fully understand. Eleanor adjusted her coat and began to walk toward the taxi waiting for her. Before getting in, she turned one last time. "Just remember, Stephen, this moment is not the end. It's only the beginning of something much greater." And then she disappeared into the night, leaving Stephen standing there with more questions than answers. The room still sparkled behind him, but now it felt irrelevant, a distant echo of a world he knew needed to change.